Welcome back to the Nerdiverse Couples Coaches Corner. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Stephanie, and I want to reintroduce you to the theme for this month. We are talking about how the church is doing better, but where we could still improve in supporting the marginalized, the abused, the traumatized, the least of these, the divergent. We're growing in awareness, but what can we do better? So today we're going to be talking about with our guest, navigating the church and the courts if you are trying to separate or leave from an abusive marriage. So I am joined by my co-host, Barbara Grant.
Hi, Stephanie. Always great to be here with you. And I am delighted that our theme this month is talking about these things so essential, so rarely discussed. And we have with us Sarah McDugal, who is also known as the Freedom Navigator. And I'm going to let her introduce and tell her story about her life experience that led her to providing amazing services across a range. Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be here with both of you. It's been a while. I know I was here a few years ago. I'm not even sure exactly when it was, but I have primarily, I think, and what we talked about last time I was here was wilderness to wild, which is growing and healing after betrayal trauma and post-separation abuse and so on. But in the last couple of years, I've really narrowed my focus to that post-separation abuse part. Everything with wilderness to wild that you know is still there. All of those things are still available, but my time is primarily dedicated to Freedom Navigator. And Freedom Navigator is born out of some of the experiences of my own journey. I was in a 9-year custody litigation battle as a protective parent. And one of the things that we often don't realize is that when you are leaving an unhealthy marriage, an unsafe marriage, and you finally realize that the reconciliation and the healing that you've been wanting is not happening, and you have to choose safety, then when you move into the court system, those behaviors that wrecked the marriage foundation very often follow you into the court system. And that's where the court system is not educated, just like the church is often not, on the nuances of abuse dynamics, power and control dynamics, coercive control. And so protective parents, especially neurodivergent ones, are very often treated in the court system as simply being a high conflict case, with the assumption that it is mutually high conflict. So you move trying to escape from the harm and get safe, establish a peaceful home, protect your kids. This behavior follows you into the court system. And before you know it, you're upside down. They're telling you you're just high conflict. You need to get along. Everybody needs to just stop having issues and work together. And that is a very, very difficult place to be. And those are the people that I work with, those protective parents.
Wow. Wow. Well, you obviously are an expert with knowledge one from the hard. You have a PhD from the School of Hard Knocks on this, I think. And
the School of Hard Knocks. I mean, I've gotten a number of like certified legal dispute resolver and professional coaching, master coaching degree, like certifications and so on. But yeah, the Hard Knocks was the initiation to it for sure.
Well, isn't that amazing? God always takes the hard-won wisdom and courage and victory we have in Him, in order with the comfort that He comforts us, so we can comfort others. So, and also guide them as they wrestle and make difficult choices. So, I think Stephanie, you have some ideas of what you want to focus on that are, also germane to some of the other topics with other guests this month that you're featuring. So why don't you start with what you want to ask Sarah?
Yeah. So let me remind the listeners of kind of how it's kind of all coming down this month. So at the very first one this month, Dan and I talked about our own personal experience. We extrapolated some interviews of neurodivergent folks and their experiences in church in general, children and young adults. Today, we're talking about abusive marriage and all of those details. Then we have Just the Guys, where John Fella and Josh Davis describe their experiences as a special needs father, and then a special needs father who finds out he's also on the spectrum and navigating false guilt and shame put upon them by the church. And then also disability in the church panel with Jillian Palmietto from Together We Care, Dr. Steve Gersovics from Disability in the Church, and Doc Hunsley of SOAR, talking about specific things you as church leaders could do to better support all the types of families that we are talking about today, with practical, some even free resources to come alongside you and train you as you know better and do better. So I want to kind of start our topic today, Sarah, about the church first before we go into it, because as Christians, since Barbara and I mostly work with Christian clients, it's like a double whammy. You're going through this horrible situation and you should have a church community that's supporting you. You hope the court is going to give you justice, and you're fighting these two spaces. And right now, at the beginning of this year, there's been all of these cases coming out of leaders, church leaders, elders who have had a moral failure, as they call it. And the focus has been on restoring them to the pulpit and restoring them to leadership more than, what about the victims? What about those who are traumatized? What about the ones who are living with the repercussion of what this person did, and that added piece of religion and spirituality that someone in authority of the Lord did this to somebody? So let's start with the church. On how can the church, what do they need to know about women in situations like yours, especially you are a pastor's wife coming out of this situation, which makes it even more challenging?
Well, for me, that phase, that chapter of my journey was now more than a decade ago. And uh, the situation, the dynamics, environment, and the amount of resources available have exploded in the past 10 years. The things that are available for leaders to recognize and educate themselves with didn't exist when I was going through this as a mother of toddler preschoolers and as a young pastor's wife. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that the church has come a long way in access to better tools than we used to have. Now, whether or not any given pastor, clergyman, priest, clergywoman, whoever it is, depending on your religious environment, whether or not your faith community leaders are availing themselves of the resources that are there, something for you to discover, obviously, right? But the resources, good resources, do exist. Now, we could be here for an entire series and never get to the court stuff, just talking about the concepts and principles behind rushing restoration to the limelight and the visibility. I think that's a conversation that to really dig down into it should carry a lot of nuance and depth with it. But the short version, circumventing some of that nuance and depth, is really that the leadership is tasked with protecting the sheep. So our primary goal should be to use whatever power we have to protect the most vulnerable around us. And rarely does rapid restoration to the spotlight for a wolf factor in as a top priority when that is our focus. So, we could have a 6-part series on,
Right.
digging into all kinds of layers with that. But I think it really just boils down to when someone has acted in a way that places them as a wolf in sheep's clothing, we don't put them back in the sheepfold or hand them a shepherd's staff or make them a sheepdog. We keep them away from the lambs because the lambs are our priority.
So, in Ezekiel, the Lord goes after the leaders for scattering the flock as fodder among the hills for the wild animals, because they have abused the sheep and they have not cared for the sheep. And he's really got it in for the religious leaders. And, sadly, we all know of all the reports over the years of court cases of different church institutions, different denominations, burying and denying the abuse that was happening, whether it was sexual abuse or any kind of abuse that was happening within the ranks. Exactly. And moving people and hiding things and, oh, we're all good. And, not letting anything be litigated or investigated and what it took to bring things to light. Right. So unfortunately, there is a hesitation, and even unfortunately, I think some leadership bodies feel that they could be sued if they lean too far into challenging certain people. I mean, the legal lines of what churches can say to people or admonish people, and this is kind of interesting to me because, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul, verses 1-8, Paul goes into great detail about how any disputes between church people, the Lord's people, should never be brought to court with non-believers, that the church should somehow judge and rule here. And it's very specific about why would you go to non-believers and, you're doing this before non-believers and the church is meant to judge. Well, I don't know that the church cultures that I see in our Western world have grown up with the amount of education and responsibility needed to make clear, discerning judgment about anything.
Well, if I can piggyback on your statement, let's keep talking about Paul here. Paul also has some very strong words about divisive people. He says, warn them once, warn them twice, and then have nothing to do with them. He has very strong words about those who are living in lust and licentiousness, those who are abusers, those who are drunken, and I would take that to mean substance abuse issues, those who are acting out with mind altering substances, that kind of thing. And those who are harsh and angry and unkind, he says, don't even eat with these kinds of people.
Yeah, we did a whole episode on this when we talked about divorce and the stigma of divorce.
Yes. So, and there's no caveat in Paul's writings that if he paid for the thing on your finger, then none of the other things apply. He's straight across the board that if a person is claiming to be a believer and is acting in these unbelieving ways in a persistent way, warn them. And if they don't change, be done. Walk away. Do not eat with them. Do not live with them. Do not fellowship with them. Do not treat them as believer equals. So I would say that if we were following that, we wouldn't need civil and criminal justice systems because we would already be trimming down those that we allow ourselves to be identified with as fellow believers in a way that had a very high filter for integrity and moral honesty and being safe humans. Because we would also be following the fruits of the Spirit, which are also laid out, not the fruits of the women, but the fruits of the Spirit. So joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, goodness, self-control. These are not feminine traits. These are Christ follower traits, which means that Paul was expecting men to be loving and peaceful and patient and kind and good and gentle and self-regulated and all of the things, and faithful. So if we held male and female to that standard for leadership, particularly because it's even a higher standard, and we were less hesitant to be decisive with those who are acting in unbelieving ways. And I don't mean surface peripherals. I mean those core integrity issues that we don't like to touch. Then I think we would have much different things. But I want to throw something out to you guys. I feel like we tend, as a faith community at large, across denominations, that we tend to entangle and intertwine our assumption that restoration to the platform, the pulpit, the position, the prestige, the power, that is the same as forgiveness and salvation.
Yeah, no.
I hear that all the time.
You're like, hey, I don't think he should be back on the platform and back in a position of power. Like, what? You think God can't restore? Absolutely, God can. These are not the same issue, not the same topic.
Well, something that I know Stephanie's researched and then, wrote uniquely us and documented very sadly all the different people we heard, especially the women and many of the Cassandra women I work with. The problem they have is that when they bring the evidence or the testimony of the abuse to the attention of church leadership, it is by and large seen suspiciously and somewhat discounted, especially when he masks and, or the husband or whoever, whatever partner is the one that is, not
directions.
Yeah. And this is, we're not just talking, I want to clarify, I'm not just talking about different behaviors, different opinions, difficult communication, emotional needs not getting met. I'm really talking about abuse, where there's verbal abuse, mental, emotional, financial, God forbid, sexual abuse going on in the home, and nobody sees it, covert abuse. And the abused spouse finally gets out of their brain fog and their cognitive dissonance and gets enough gumption up to say, wait a minute, this is not okay. This is what's going on, and is not believed and is seen, as I was, as the bitter, nagging shrew who, how you have a problem with bitterness, sister. And I mean, the way I dealt with that was, okay, maybe I do. Let me look at that. And I went and bought black clothing at Goodwill. And for 2 weeks, I wore nothing but black. I lived in LA. Nobody noticed in LA. Everyone wears black. I didn't know black. So I was wearing black. My husband didn't notice. And I was grieving and I was fasting and I was in sackcloth and ashes in my own way. And I pulled I pulled that bitter root out of my heart. I'm like, never again am I going to be. But I started learning boundaries, which really guards against bitterness. And I started to assert myself, and I started to find safe people to talk to and build my joy team and, build momentum and self-care that could help me stand against what leadership was telling me, which was I was nuts, he was fine. And what was my problem? I needed to repent. So can we talk a little bit about that church leadership is in some places, like in my own church, okay? A woman who I know 13 years ago was in an abusive marriage and had 3 children. There's neurodiversity in their family. And her husband finally left. But in the process of her demanding he leave and her divorcing him, she was called on the carpet by the elders, and they reamed her. And the fact that she stayed in the church is a miracle to me. She crawled into some corner. She goes, well, this is where my kids feel safe. And I know the teachers and I have some friends, Only last year did the new elder board under new leadership reach out to her to apologize.
Wow.
And to own.
That's also shocking.
Yes. So things are going in a better direction.
Right?
Not to restore, to own it, to apologize. Right. And the new pastor who is leading is he preached about divorce. It's one of the best things I've ever heard about, God doesn't hate divorce. This is life-saving sometimes, and all of that. So
Gretchen's book.
I know, and we're gonna hopefully be talking to Gretchen. We're booking
Yes,
Gretchen.
she's one of my favorite people. Love her.
Yes, yeah. So let's talk about that in terms of, what people have to push through to still be heard, like the persistent widow knocking on the guy's door, like, I'm coming for justice. I'm not going to be told no, right? And how, if it's not church leadership that guides them towards support in the courts, which is legally, that's how it has to go anyway, right? The church can't rule on custody and joint finances and then forget that. Can you talk about that?
I have so many thoughts. So let me outline a couple of points, and then I will try to go back and flesh them out. One, if you happen to be neurodivergent, it's going to be harder. Two, we have to remember how long it took us to have a recognition of what we were living with and give other people grace. Three, you don't need to go to your church about it. And we might need to work backwards through those.
Right. Because I want to talk about some of the things I've heard pastors say.
Sure.
I had a case about 15 years ago, and I was really fearful of this woman's life based on some of the things that were happening. The person had a felony background,
Right.
wasn't supposed to own a gun, had a gun, was making threats,
Right.
like doing stuff to the car, cutting up clothing. I mean, it was like crazy stuff. And she decides she's going to, try to leave. And she got a restraining order. And the church put so much pressure on her to try to drop the restraining order because you can't restrict him from coming to church. He needs to be ministered to
Right.
as well. And if you put that restraining order on him, you are hurting his spiritual discipline. He can't be restored without, the elders and the board and the leadership. And I was like, well, then take him to coffee because the wife and the children should be coming to church,
What is their stance on shut-ins?
Yeah.
Like, are they lost?
Right.
Unreachable?
But here are some of the things that the men who were elders at that time would say. Innocent until proven guilty. If it really was that bad, why'd she stay? And then what was the other part? Oh, about forgiveness and restoration, back again to redemption. And why can't she forgive? And if she truly forgives, then you have to restore and you have to reconcile. And then sadly, my jaded part of me says, I think churches struggle because that's probably the biggest tithe giver. And to call out the abuser means you're possibly going to get rid of the one who's giving money to the church. So I want to kind of cover that. And then I want to say to my church leaders who are listening, you are mandated reporters. You don't get to handle abuse of minorities, the mentally ill, the incapacitated, and the elderly. You do not get to handle that. You are a mandated reporter, and you are not following civil authority or God's authority if you try to handle such. So I just wanted to preach on that little box right there. Reverend Stephanie came out, and I'll push her back down. But all of those things that women share, Sarah, talk through that.
No, I like her.
We like Reverend Stephanie. Let her stay.
I'm thinking as you're talking through this, I'm thinking about one afternoon in my own story. I haven't thought about this in a long time. And every now and then I'll remember some little snippet and bring it out into the sunlight. But there was a time where I had been threatened related to an AK-47, and I knew that there were a lot of guns in our home. I didn't know where they all were. I knew that they were not locked away. They were not in a safe. We had little kids, and I refused to go home after that threat was made. Some counselors got involved. The administrative oversight for our denominational region got involved. And over the next several days, I refused to return home based on a counselor's recommendation until all of the guns were removed from the home. I was very scared for the safety of myself and my children if we went back into the home. I was actually scared to go back at all, but I felt like I was required to go back. And because I didn't know how to handle things properly through the civil and criminal system, and I had no exposure to that, my natural place to turn was to my religious leadership. And I know that I'm not the only one. That's very common. Now, I would not think twice. I would call secular public governance authorities, and I would not at all turn to religious leadership. I don't think that that is the best way to handle it. But I know I was one who immediately turned to religious leadership, and there are many where that is our first instinct. So I'm not judging there. I'm suggesting a different path, but definitely not judging. I did it too. And so the next day, he said that he had packed up all of the weapons and he was going to bring them to my dad to keep them stored outside of the home. And I looked at them all and I counted them and I knew there were more. And he said, no, there aren't. And I said, yes, there are. I actually have a list written down of things that I've known about. So unless you've sold a bunch, in which case, where's the money? I know that there are more. And then there was this, I guess I forgot. Like, there's that one, and then there's that one, and then there's her here. So at this point, I was like, I'm not going home. And I had already loaded up my car. The kids were buckled in the back in their car seats. They were little. And I unbuckled them. I said, I'm not going back. You didn't keep, like, I had one request, and it was a safety-driven request. So then I called one of the administrators and I said, look, this is what's going on. And his response was, you are being so unforgiving.
Oh, my goodness.
You are being so unforgiving. You need to just acknowledge that there was an effort made. I said, the whole point is not going back into a home where there's a ton of guns. And we're talking like more than a dozen, like a number of weapons.
So what you're describing is the difference between forgiveness, which is releasing somebody from the debt of needing to repay the damage. You release them. But then there is trust that has to be restored. It's restoration is rebuilding trust. And I tell many people, and sometimes they're savvy, financially savvy people that I'm talking to, I say, look, if you have an 829 credit score, good for you. If you stop paying all your bills and screw your credit up in 3 months, you're going to be down in the 600s and 500s. Guess what? You can now start doing everything right again, but those credit companies are not going to give you a high credit score. They're going to remember for 7 years how bad you screwed up, and you have to live that down and live through it. And now you have to rebuild, trust, credit worthiness, all of that. And when I put it in financial terms, they're like, oh, and I'm like, that's restored credit, but creditors can forgive your debt and even you can file bankruptcy, but your credit worthiness, your credibility is toast. And so that's why we talk a lot about godly sorrow, because we talk about in 2 Corinthians 7, the chapter 7, Paul describes an eagerness to prove yourself, a readiness to see justice done, an indignation with your sin, a grievance, a remorse, a concern, an urgency. When you're godly sorrowful for what you've done, you're like, honey, here's all my guns, here's all my ammo. Strip search me, like let me show you.
I threw in all the army knives for good measure. I unloaded the kitchen knives. I went above and beyond.
Exactly. Eagerness to clear yourself, right? Readiness to see justice done. Like, I don't deserve you. I don't deserve to be your husband. You may forgive me, but I have to earn back your trust. I blew it. I broke it. That's what the Bible teaches us. Right. So, just forgive him. And now he's restored. Like, whoa. That is nowhere in the Bible. Right.
And the message for that particular time was like, why are you being such a cranky person about this? So what if he didn't bring all of them? And I just said, well, I'm not going back until I know that it's at least that safety step has been taken.